Good evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind with Gayle Jessup White talking about her new book, Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a Descendant's Search for Her Family's Lasting Legacy. I'm Ariel Zeitlin. I'm one of the librarians here at Montclair Public Library. And first, I'd just like to draw your attention to the Q&A button. If you're using a computer or a smartphone, it's at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a tablet, it's at the top of your screen. That's how you can send us your questions for the Q&A, and it's also how you can ask for live tech help from my librarian co-host, Alex Russo, at any time during the webcast. Now, I'd like to introduce Susan Moline, a member of the board of our Library Foundation. Welcome, Sue.
Thanks, Ariel. Hi, everyone. We're so happy you're here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. It's going to be a terrific program. I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Montclair Public Library Foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money to fund the offerings that make our library so special. This includes programs like this one, staff development, building restoration, and other needs that aren't covered by town funding. Your donations support everything from laptop lending and Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access to lifelong learning classes, homework tutoring and resume help, and children's reading programs. Most recently, your donations enabled a significant growth in e-content during the pandemic. So after you enjoy this event, we hope you'll make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for all that you do, Sue. And if anyone in the audience wants to contribute to the library in other ways, please search for Friends of the Montclair Public Library on our website or on Facebook. Now, I'm very happy to welcome our guest of honor this evening, Gayle Jessup White. Gayle is a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and is also related to two well-documented families enslaved at Monticello, the Hemingses and the Hubbards. She serves as the Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer at Monticello, her ancestors' legendary estate. Gayle is a former television reporter and anchor who started her career at the New York Times and has written and spoken extensively about her work at Monticello. She lives in Virginia. Welcome, Gayle.
Thank you so much, Ariel. I am thrilled to be here. And I know that in New Jersey, in that part of the country, people say Monticello. In Virginia, however, we say Monticello.
Okay. Well, I stand corrected. Gayle's debut memoir, Reclamation, is available to buy at our program partner, Watch on Booksellers, and to borrow through the library. It's already gotten a lot of attention. As Henry Louis Gates Jr. said, in a real-life version of Roots, Gayle Jessup White's compelling exploration of her family ties to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings's family demonstrates that America's complex racial history is written in our DNA. And now, I'm also delighted to introduce Gayle's conversation partner, Dionne Ford. Dionne is the co-editor of the anthology Slavery's Descendants, Shared Legacies of Race and Reconciliation, and she also has a memoir forthcoming about her own enslaved ancestor that's called Go Back and Get It. Dionne is a longtime resident of Montclair and a member of the Open Book, Open Mind Advisory Board. Welcome, Dionne.
Thank you, Ariel. I'm so excited to be here tonight.
Well, we're really excited to have you both. And this is the moment everybody's been waiting for. And for all of you at home, I just want to remind you that you can start submitting your questions to the Q&A button while the conversation is going on. And I'll be back after the Q&A period. See you in a bit.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Gayle,
Hi,
yay.
Dionne. I'm so glad to
Hi.
see you. Yes, and thank you for sending this to me in 2019. Congratulations. I saw my cousins in here and people I know, and this is just wonderful.
Exactly. So it's so special to be able to talk to you after so many years of kind of, crossing paths with our research and also coming to the table. And so this is just such a pleasure. And on a personal note, from one genealogy buff to another, it's also always such a treat to talk to other people who are just so kind of, wrapped up and cloaked in these searches that are, really sacred for us, and that, like you, my family doesn't really get or care that much about. So I had that with you in common. You talked about that. So
Some members do and some members don't. But my
yeah,
sisters, my son, my brother, not so much. So
yeah.
yeah.
I'm the same. So, I thought, if you don't mind, your prologue so beautifully situates and orients us in your quest. And it also starts in the cemetery, a sacred place. So if it's okay, if you wouldn't mind maybe reading a little bit from it
No,
to
not at all. Not
get
at all.
us oriented and to kick off our discussion.
I'm glad you asked me to. Let me get it in here. So I'll just read a little bit of this. If I go on too long, you just let me know. So there are at least 2 known burial grounds at Monticello, the estate that was Thomas Jefferson's home. One is near the main house and surrounded by an imposing wrought iron fence. It is populated with tombstones marked Jefferson, Randolph, Taylor, and the surnames of other kin. Jefferson's grave is marked by an obelisk adorned with an inscription of how he wished to be remembered. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. The graveyard is still in use. It is the only property on the former plantation not owned by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, the nonprofit that owns and manages Monticello, but by a group called the Monticello Association, whose members are direct descendants of Thomas Jefferson and his wife, Martha Wales Skelton. From time to time, members of the association gather for burial or a wreath-laying ceremony to commemorate their legendary ancestor. Only Jefferson, his white family, and their descendants and spouses are buried there. Only they are welcome. That was made painfully clear a few years after a white descendant invited dozens of his Black cousins to an association reunion. They were guests because they too can trace their origins to the 3rd president.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I think that wonderfully gets us started. So first, let me just say, you go on to really talk about your purpose and feeling very called, not only to find this history, but to tell it. And the part of that telling it also to, go and work at Monticello. And so you get to do that. And I just wondered, particularly reading that prologue, what it's like to go to work every day where your ancestors lived and now remain or buried.
Well, for me, it's uplifting because I know that, like most Black Americans, and most of us are descended from enslaved people, that my ancestors were strong and they were resilient and they were dutiful to their families and honorable people. And I know that because they survived that oppressive system and because we're standing here today. So when I'm in that space, I feel them. In some ways, they talk to me, which is why I was compelled to write this story. I'm so fortunate to know a lot of my family's history, this line of my family. because of Thomas Jefferson, frankly, because people have been interested in Thomas Jefferson, for better or worse, for a couple of hundred years now, and because he kept such copious notes. So we know in the farm book the names of enslaved people. We know what he paid for them. We know when he sold them. We know when he gifted them. We're talking about human beings now. We know in many cases their surnames and their ages and the clothing that was distributed to them. I know more about my enslaved family than the overwhelming majority of Black people know. And so it was important to me to share this story because it's my sincere hope that when people read this story, they will read about their own families. They will see their own families in my family because we're not different. What my family endured is no different from what yours did and what others endured. It's just I know mine. And I'm proud of my ancestors. I'm proud of what they were able to accomplish and how they survived. What I didn't read in the prologue here is about the enslaved graveyard, or the graveyard of enslaved people. And because I didn't want to keep us all night reading, we could just go through and read all 300 pages. So I thought better not that we get started with too much of that. But on the top of the mountain, and Monticello is on a mountain, there's the graveyard where the white family is entombed in Jefferson. On the bottom of that mountain, there's a grave site where the enslaved, or at least 40 of the enslaved, are buried. And it's that space where I frequently go, actually, where I seek comfort and I seek inspiration. So I'm really, I feel fortunate to be able to walk in the footsteps of my ancestors. And I know it was hard for them. I know it was horrible for them. But I also know about our ancestors is that they managed to scratch out some kind of lives for themselves, and that they managed to find, not an enslavement, but within their families, some kind of joy. And that's what I experience when I'm at Monticello.
Thank you. So you talked about very poignantly how much information you're able to find, and that is, not the case really for most people where, their ancestors were enslaved. So I hope you can, but you did also have, lovely heirlooms and things that were passed down before you delved into the Jefferson archive, like the beautiful pictures that you share in the book that were so pretty, and the lovely ode that one of the family members delivered to you when your uncle died, I believe. I was wondering if you could just share some of your, I guess, most treasured things that you were able to find in the archives, but also something treasured to you before, not having to do with the archives. And I ask that because I feel like as I've searched my own family's history, there were things that were kind of right around me that I guess I didn't realize how precious they were until I had done so much research. So yeah, any of your thoughts on that?
So in the archives at Monticello, and I would also add Poplar Forest, which was Jefferson's retreat, there are, and at the University of Virginia, at the small collection there are mostly archival material collected from Jefferson's white family. There is mostly archival material from the Jefferson family and the Randolph families. And for me, the most remarkable thing was holding in my hand letters that were 200 years old, 150 years old, mentioning that I would eventually learn the names of my family. Initially, I saw the names of my white ancestors. And that, I mean, it's in the DNA, so that was intriguing for me. But as time went on and I began to learn who my Black ancestors were, I realized I was reading the names of my Black ancestors in those documents. Now, they were written about as an aside. Sally did, not Sally Hemings, not the famous Sally Hemings, but my ancestor's name was also Sally. Sally was called upon to do this, or another ancestor was called upon to do that. So it was exciting, really thrilling for me to read about these people who were related to me and to whom I could relate, my Black ancestors. But in my own collection, I think that my most valuable possession, so valuable that I keep it in a safety deposit box at the bank, is a Bible. And the Bible has the date of 1821 on it with the initials DT, and it's palm-sized. And it was passed down from generation to generation. And that was the first tangible clue that I had tying my Black family to Thomas Jefferson. Not that the T represents Jefferson. I would eventually learn that the T represented Taylor, which was a name that my grandmother used, and also a name of Jefferson's, one of Jefferson's great-great-grandsons. So just for clarification, since we've stepped into these waters, I'm not descended from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. I'm descended from Thomas Jefferson's great-great-grandson, one of his great-great-grandsons, whose name was Moncure Robinson Taylor. And the reason this is important, historically important, is because it solidifies for us our knowledge of what was happening at Monticello and surrounding plantations and the other plantations Jefferson owned, and within that family, which also symbolizes what was happening in plantations all over. So let's just recount this. Everyone knows, or many people know, about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that they had 6 children together, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. Many people know that Sally Hemings was Jefferson's wife's half-sister, that Jefferson's father-in-law had relations with Sally Hemings' mother, Elizabeth. So we're in 2 generations now of Hemingses and people related to Jefferson. Let's go to a 3rd generation. Thomas Jefferson's son-in-law took up with a Hemings woman, Betsy Hemings, after his wife Jefferson's daughter died. So that's 3 generations. And then we have my ancestors, my direct line, Thomas Jefferson's great-great-grandson, who took up with a Hemings woman. I didn't know any of this until just a few years ago. So that's 4 generations of Hemingses and Jefferson-related family members having relations. And I use the word relations rather than relationship, because relationship connotes something more intimate. And relations, of course, would be something that doesn't involve, how do I put this? Doesn't involve the kinds of intimacy, feelings, association, caring for that we would expect for in a relationship.
My grandmother would say relations. I think you talk about in the book.
Yes.
One of your older relatives saying relations.
That would be my mother. Yeah, I mean,
technical.
You can suspect it was more transactional would be the word with you. So yeah. So that was new information. Historians didn't know that. My family was hidden because I didn't know much about them. And I explain all that in the book, why I didn't know. And all that is part of the saga. It's part of the narrative now.
Yeah. And it is, as you said, it's very reflective of a common practice, right?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
So,
I mean, in your own family.
In my own family, I mean, it's almost a complete mirror, you know. Also 6 children from those relations.
Yes. And your great-grandmother, was it Josephine, or your great-great-grandmother? Or
so my great-grandmother was Josephine. My great-great-grandmother, her mother was Tempe, and it was the Colonel Stewart that was Josephine's father. And Josephine was one of 6 kids with that, Tempe and the Colonel had together through their relations. But yeah, he was the enslaver, and she was enslaved. And I think also it's the same, right? That Sally Hemings came through that family, was handed down in that family through Jefferson's wife, correct?
So yes, Jefferson inherited the Hemings family, including Elizabeth, after his father-in-law died. The women couldn't inherit unless they were unmarried. The husband inherited the wealth. And so the family was passed down. Human beings were passed down from one family to another.
Yeah, it was the same. And that actually brings me to my next question, which you've already set up about this difficulty of researching people who were enslaved, because they are not treated like people. They're treated like property. So there are often no names associated with them, just descriptions. And the way to get any information about them is really through the descendants of the people who enslaved them.
Right.
So awkward. So you talk about in the book about your connecting with one such person who was not just the descendant of the people who had enslaved your people, but also your blood relative, which is also something that people who have ancestors who are enslaved contend with. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how that was for you. I'm interested in both how it was for your research, because that's one of the just sort of, realities that we need to, have access to them in order to find out things. So I wonder if it helped in that way, and also how it was for you personally.
So you're talking about Tess Taylor, I think, who is in the same line. We come from the same family line. She is a tailor. My grandmother was a tailor. And Tess and I met via the internet, because she'd written a book of poetry, had published a book of poetry called The Forge House. And I liked what I read about it, reached out to her, and we began a conversation that went on for quite a while. And she wrote a piece about our meeting in the New York Times, which I talk about in the book. And after that piece was published, Skip Gates reached out, or someone from his team reached out and asked if we would be interested in DNA testing. And of course we were. And we did Ancestry, not a plug, but it was Ancestry, DNA, and 23andMe. And my sister, by the way, my oldest sister, Janice, was a partner with me for many, many years in trying to untangle how we would have been related to Thomas Jefferson. I did not grow up knowing this. I learned this from my sister. So when we got the idea that when we were invited to do the DNA testing, my sister and I debated briefly about whether we would actually go through with it, because all these decades, we're talking literally decades, we were convinced we were a descendant from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. So this could have given us proof or not. So obviously we decided to go through with it. And it turns out that yes, in fact, we are descended from so many Randolphs who were married into the Jefferson family, and his mother was a Randolph. And all the evidence lined up, all the DNA evidence lined up perfectly with the oral history and what a researcher at Monticello named Cinder Stan and I have been able to ascertain from very loose documents. So that for me was very rewarding. Relationships with people, white people, with whom we haven't grown up, even when we share blood, when we share DNA, can be fraught. There's an unfamiliarity there. We don't know each other. We don't have the same social experiences. It makes it difficult to cross that barrier. And it's easier with some than with others. And people have tried. And I have tried. And I continue to hold dear many of my white cousins. And Tess was helpful. We don't talk as much as we used to, but that DNA that she was willing, that DNA testing, when she was willing to participate, really turned the corner in my uncovering who my family was. And I will always be appreciative to her for that, even if there were other challenges. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think you put that really well about how, when you don't grow up with people, I think no matter if they're, Black or white, it's a challenge, right? To come into relationship with people at such a different phase in your lives, rather than knowing each other and growing up together. So.
But I will add this. I'm going to take my jacket off because it's getting warm in my house. The thermostat is too high. I will add this, that I've also met my Black cousins, descended from various families at Monticello. And I have to tell you, it's a different experience. And a lot of that is because some of them grew up in Washington, D.C., as I did. Some grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Some grew up in other parts of the country. But it's that shared history, that shared history of knowing that our people were oppressed, that shared history of being marginalized. And sometimes it's that shared history of food and music and culture that bring us together naturally. And I write about this in the book. I met cousins. I'm not a young person. I met cousins for the first time when I was well into my 50s. And it wasn't long before we felt as if we'd known each other forever, because we have that shared background. So it was easier. However, it's also the obstacles that I faced with my white family, I must add, were important to overcome. And I say that because if people who share DNA can't figure out how to get along, then what does that say for the rest of America? So we have to figure out a way to care about each other. And we have. It's not the same. I acknowledge it's not the same. I walked into the house of my 90-year-old cousin, having never met her before, Black cousin, and felt immediately at home. It was like walking to my own house. I walked into the home of my white cousin and felt comfortable. Beautiful home, beautiful home. They were both beautiful homes, but it wasn't that same level of feeling embraced. And that's what we have to work on.
Yeah, that definitely came through in the book, when that sense of immediate at-homeness.
Yes.
Your Black cousins towards the end. It was really lovely. And I had a nice experience like that with my own cousin, who happens to live in New Jersey too. It was just very special. So yeah, I can definitely understand that. You said you grew up in DC, but at a certain point you moved to Richmond.
Right.
And you do talk about the Confederate monuments and, I guess just kind of contending with them being there. And of course, Confederate monuments have taken center stage in the last couple of years after the murder of George Floyd and the call to, tear them down.
Mm-hmm.
Along with that reckoning has now also come a conversation about taking down monuments and memorials to presidents who were slaveholders. And so I wonder what you think about that in terms of Thomas Jefferson, if that's something that you think is appropriate, if it's something you think should not be done, just your thoughts on it.
So Let me just say this about Confederate statues. First of all, the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue are gone. I never thought I'd see that day. I went down several times, I don't live far from there, to watch this, look at the statues, watch them come down, look at the Lee statue with the, we'll call it graffiti art. It was spectacular. That turned into a place. Monument Avenue was considered the Champs-Élysées. I'm tired. My French is not good tonight. The Champs-Élysées of.
My French is never good. So.
and it was beautiful, but marred by these gargantuan tributes to traitors. They needed to come down. So that place was turned into party ground for people who knew that something miraculous and monumental was happening. It became a center of festivals last summer. It was amazing. So they needed to come down. Every statue of a traitor to the United States of America should be destroyed. There are things I don't like about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and the presidents, 12 presidents who were slaveholders. There are things I disdain about them that disturb me. They were not traitors to America. The founders helped build America, as flawed as those founders were. I think what we need to do is study that history of the founding, such as is done in the 1619 Project, phenomenal work. Make it more inclusive. Celebrate what we have all contributed to American history. Recognize how much Black people and enslaved people and other peoples have done to make America the country that it is. And find a place for those statues not to be celebrated. I don't think they should be celebrated, but to be acknowledged as part of American history.
You know, that makes me think of, there's this part in the book towards the end where you talk about like people, you know, during presentations asking you, like, if you sound proud of Thomas Jefferson, or are you proud? And you say that I think you say you're an unapologetic Jefferson descendant, not ashamed and not.
Right.
Something like that, just that it's the truth. And I feel like that is the same, that's echoing what you're talking about now, that there's a truth that is just the heart. It seems to me like the heart of why you were on this whole quest in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. It is imperative that we tell as much of the truth, historical truth, as possible, and not run from it. And for us as Black people, let me reverse this a little bit, to claim that truth. That's why the book is called Reclamation. We built the Capitol. We built the White House. Enslaved children helped make the bricks that built Monticello. We claim that. That's our history. This is our country. So no, I'm not ashamed or proud. I just recognize it as part of history. And that's important.
It is important. And you know, you saying that reclamation, that is another thing that came through for me reading this book. You talk about home and belonging, and those moments where people recognize, you know, you being home really, really struck me. And it made me think that, you know, that this was a journey of belonging in a family of kinfolk, blood folk, but also in a country, you know, that has not made Black people feel often like we belong here.
Absolutely.
And so that really, really resonated for me. Particularly oh, well, let me first ask, before I ask that, about what it was like for you to, during the time you were working there, Sally Hemings's room was
Yes.
discovered.
Yes.
You got to be a part of, discussions about how the room would be interpreted and her life there would be interpreted. So I was hoping you could just share with us what that process was like for you personally, but also as she's going to be now standing in, right, for enslaved women. So her life would speak to what it was like for a woman to be enslaved. So I was wondering if you could just talk about what that process was like. It feels like a tremendous responsibility.
Well, so I shared in that responsibility with my colleagues at Monticello. Just a little bit of background here. Monticello has for some 28 years now had a project called, an initiative called the Getting Word Oral History Project, founded by Cinder Stanton, who's white, and the late Diane Swan Wright, who is Black. And Cinder was and is my mentor. And the Getting Word Oral History Project sought to collect the stories of the descendants of enslaved people. And those stories helped inform some of the work we do and some of the work I do, a lot of the work we do at Monticello. Now in 2017, I think it was, actually I started working at Monticello in 2016, then begun a process of thinking about what an exhibition would look like devoted to Sally Hemings. So there were a lot of us involved in this, and this had been given a lot of thought for a long time. The room, if you've been to Monticello, you've got the main house, and then you've got wings that are attached to the house, L-shaped. So there's some distance from the house, and they're below ground. They're below the house, which is up on a mountain, up on a little hill. And these corridors are below it. And in that space, it's believed was Sally Hemings's room. And the reason we believe that is because Jefferson's grandson, who happens to have been my 3 times great-grandfather, told one of his first biographers, this is the room where Sally Hemings and her children lived. And what we decided to do was to create an image of Sally Hemings that would leave something to the imagination of the viewer. So you don't have Sally, we have a description, at least two people describe Sally Hemings as being, one enslaved person said, mighty near white, that's a quote, with long hair hanging down her back. Well, so what is that? That's different for different people. The same grandson said that Sally Hemings and one of her sisters were very good looking. What is that? That again means different things to different people. So we decided to build this image of Sally Hemings around a figure, a frame with just a body, and to dress the frame in garments that she would have worn during the time of her enslavement. And upon that garment, we projected images that reflected her life from the time she was taken to Europe, to France, to be the enslaved servant or the maid to his daughters, to the time of her death. And it's very powerful. These images are very powerful. And on the wall in this small room, it's a small room, only 15 people can get in there at a time, are projected the words of one of their sons, Madison Hemings, where he talked about in a memoir in the mid-19th century about his mother and his father. It is in this document where he describes her as Jefferson's concubine, his words, and he describes that they had children together, and they had children with he had children with no other enslaved person, and she had children with no one else. What we also do in this exhibition is present Sally Hemings not as an appendage of a powerful man, but as a woman, as a human who had skills and character and traits. For example, she likely spoke French. She was a world traveler. She was a seamstress. She was a mother. She was an emancipator, because Sally Hemings negotiated with Jefferson freedom for their unborn children in exchange for her returning to the States with him when they were in Europe. That's very powerful. And she has become a symbol of enslaved women. But more to the point for me, she becomes a symbol of a woman who exercised for a brief moment in time agency that gave freedom to her children. Now, they were enslaved for 21 years. Jefferson did indeed enslave his own children for 21 years, but they were eventually freed. And she did that. Jefferson enslaved during his lifetime more than 600 people. It's so important to remember that Sally Hemings was just one of 600. We need is a strong word, but I think I will use it anyway. We need to learn more about other people. It's great that we have this symbol in Sally Hemings, but there's so many more people. And I'll give you an example. I said that I am not descended from Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. I'm descended from a Hemings family member, Peter Hemings. Peter Hemings was my 3 times great-grandfather and a brother of Sally Hemings. Peter Hemings was taught the art of French cookery by his brother, James, who learned the art of French cooking when he was in Paris as an enslaved chef with Jefferson. That was part of a negotiation made with Jefferson and James, who wanted to be free. Jefferson agreed to free James Hemings, but only if he taught someone else to cook. That other person was my 3 times great-grandfather. Near the exhibition of Sally Hemings is the original kitchen at Monticello. It was covered up for a couple of 100 years until 2017. When that kitchen was unearthed, we actually found soot from the last meals that were cooked there. That ground hadn't been touched on for 200 years. I went in that space. That was my great-great-great-grandfather's space where he learned to cook, where he cooked for 12 years. I went in that space and I took off whatever I was wearing and I rubbed my hands in that soil, and I rubbed that soil up and down my arms, because that is the space of our ancestors claimed it. So that was very moving. It's not just Sally Hemings. It's Peter Hemings and James Hemings and the others who were enslaved there, the Hubbard brothers, 2 of whom, the Hubbard family, 2 of the brothers ran away. One of them ran away twice, James Hubbard. When he was brought back in chains, Jefferson had him whipped and he was sold south, never to be heard from again. So it's not just Sally Hemings. And these stories represent, again, what the ancestors of many, I'm going to say most Black people's family experienced.
Well, you touched on what was going to be my next question, and what I was thinking would be my last question, because it so moved me. I wasn't going to tell all of the details because I was going to let people read it themselves. But when you talked about that discovery and going there and, you know, putting the earth on you, it brought me to tears. And it's the kind of thing that felt so sacred. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that many people will never have specifically. However, these places that we can create as sacred places for people to, you know, remember and to, you know, pay some devotional time, they're so important. And so I wonder if you feel like, I know that it, you know, has that quality for you, you described it, but does Monticello have that quality for someone like me, or people whose ancestors were enslaved? Is there a space there that is a place that can hold us in that sacred way?
So I can't say if it can hold people in that sacred way. It's a very personal experience for me. But I can say that I think Monticello is the epicenter for American history. As one of my colleagues said a couple of days ago, what story can't be told from Monticello's perspective? Everything happened there. Freedom happened there. Slavery happened there. Women being marginalized happened there. Black people shaping the best lives they could happened there. Everything happened there. And at Monticello, as I said, it can be a sacred experience for people. It can be a moving experience for people. It is certainly a place to come and learn a complete history. And I would encourage people to come there and to collect that history. Black and white people, to know of the contributions, again, because it's the epicenter right there at Monticello, of the contributions of Black Americans. I would like to add this too. The people who were enslaved at Monticello were listening. They were hearing conversations about freedom. They were hearing conversations about politics. The descendants of the Monticello enslaved community took those messages and they spread the ideas of freedom and equality. There were descendants who were conductors on the Underground Railroad. There were descendants who were part of the suffragist movement. There were descendants who were active in civil rights. My favorite descendant is William Monroe Trotter, phenomenal individual, forgotten to history. You want to talk about statues? We're going to have statues to individuals, and I'm not sure that we should have statues to individuals at all, but that's another thing. But if we're going to have statues to individuals, there needs to be one for William Monroe Trotter. So when you come to Monticello, sacred, maybe. Inspiring, yes, because you'll hear those stories of the descendants of the enslaved and how they carried the ideas and ideals of liberation with them, how they became the social conscious of America. And that's important as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gayle. I'm going to open up. I see there's a question in the chat, and I think it kind of dovetails with what I was asking about. The questioner is Carol, and she says, when I was at Monticello about 10 years ago, I was shocked to see the state and location of the slave cemetery. Has it been fixed up and given its proper respect on the plantation grounds?
I love that question, and thank you for it. And what I write about in the book is the contrast, and I alluded to it earlier, the contrast between Jefferson's gravesite and the family gravesite and the beautiful monuments they have there. And then on the bottom of the mountain, you have the site where the enslaved are, where there's the only representation there are rocks and stones. And that's as it would have existed 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, actually. And it does appear to be in a state of disrepair. However, Monticello is, and I think I'm not revealing anything that I shouldn't at this point, but changes are coming. Let me just put it to you like that. Changes are coming to that spot. And we at Monticello, and I'm on the staff there, hold that space as sacred ground, and which needs to be protected. So there are initiatives moving forward now to protect that space. So if you come a year from now, it won't look as it did 10 years ago and as it does today.
Wonderful. I did have the chance to go for the first time a couple months ago with my sister. And unfortunately, the day, it was pretty rainy. So we didn't stay. I think it was like actually right when one of the hurricanes was blowing in. And we were actually lucky to even get there at all, because afterwards the roads were shut. So I didn't get a chance to take in as much of it, but I did get to go down Mulberry Row.
Yes, Mulberry Row.
very, very beautiful. And
So for people who don't know, Mulberry Row is where the enslaved lived and worked. It was the main street of Monticello. And there we have restored houses there where the enslaved lived, and spaces like the joinery where John Hemings made exquisite furniture, and representations of what it would have been like, albeit much more pristine than it would have been, because if you'd been there 250 years ago, you would have heard animals, you would have heard children, you would have heard people barking orders, you would have heard dogs barking, and there would have been the sense of, as in the odors of the era as well. So you miss all that. It's really pristine now, but I encourage people when they come to imagine what it was like 250 years ago, to imagine the people who were there, to imagine the enslaved people, not as enslaved, but as people, because that gives the enslaved their humanity. So yes, they worked hard, and yes, they were trapped there. They were imprisoned at that place, but Monticello was also their home. There's a story that the guides like to tell. It's a great story of a man named Peter Fawcett, who was enslaved as a child in Monticello, and he's a Hemings family member. His grandmother, was free, and she had been enslaved, but she was free and was married to a white man, a common law marriage, whose name was Ball. And I think I've got that right. And she used to buy things and gift him with things, and he had clothes and shoes and nice things, and he didn't know he was enslaved until he was put on an auction block in 1826, 6 months after Jefferson died on July 4th, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was written. He didn't know he was enslaved. He was sold, and he fought much of his life to gain his freedom. And he did. When he was an old man, around the turn of the 20th century, he moved to Ohio and he became a pastor of a church and a caterer. As an old man, he was asked by his parishioners, "What would you like?" And he said, "I want to go back to Monticello." Because for him, it was paradise on earth, he said. So for those enslaved people, imprisoned as they were, that was their home. At any given time, there were more Black people at Monticello than there were white people. Again, reclamation, reclaim that space. Know what we did to make that space successful. So that's what I ask people to experience when they're there. To see the enslaved as multidimensional. Yes, there were miseries, but you know what? At night, when they weren't working, when nobody was watching, they were playing. And how do we know that? Because we found instruments down along Mulberry Row. And we found toys that children had along Mulberry Row. They were human beings with the same needs we have.
thank you for that, Gayle. Ariel has a question for you. She asks, what do you think Sally Hemings would think of her current fame? What would the Hemingses have thought of it? And
I have no idea.
could they have ever met?
I have no idea. I mean, nobody really knows anything about her personality, so who can answer that? Sally Hemings was written about back in newspapers. They referred to as Dusky Sally, when Jefferson was president. So whether she knew about those publications or not, we don't know. I have no idea how she would feel about it. No, sorry. So I'm not a historian. I'm a trained journalist, but I've learned a few things from historians, and I'm very careful about speculation. Yes.
Of course, no mind reading. Okay. Kim McLaren asks, big question, but what would you tell your ancestors about where we are today? And by the way, running to Watchung tomorrow to get your books. So,
oh, thanks. So what would I tell my ancestors? I would tell our first of all, I would thank them.
Mm.
That's number one. Thank you. Thank you. In fact, not I would, I do. I thank my ancestors all the time for the life I have because they provided that foundation and they've been inspiring me for several years now. They led me to this place. You said I'm from DC. I like to tell people I'm a total DC girl. I love my hometown. Richmond's great. I've adopted it, but I love my hometown. There's absolutely no reason in the world for me to be in Richmond aside from the ancestors calling me to do this work. Charlottesville's not far from where I live. So first I would express my gratitude. And then I would tell them, I would want to share with them that we have fought a good fight in their names and that we're still fighting and that we're never, ever, ever, ever going to give up. We're not going to give up. We're going to hold, I'm assuming we're talking about Black ancestors, but if we're talking the white ones, I would tell Jefferson, we are gonna hold this country to the truths you said were ours as human beings, that all men/humans are created equal. We're going to hold this country to that. And we've been fighting for that ever since. So I would tell them to have faith and thank you.
Thank you. Loretha says, you indicated that your brother was not interested in this research. Did he discuss why? And was it too painful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's exactly why. We know that enslaved women were raped. We know that women who, even after emancipation, were exploited. It's possible that's what happened to my great-grandmother with Jefferson's great-great-grandson. I don't know. I'd like to imagine otherwise, but I don't have any evidence. So my brother hates that idea, as did my dad. I didn't learn about this history until I was 13 years old, in part because my dad, who was a white-looking man, had red hair when he was young, was 6'2", and freckles, did not like to talk about it because he resented the way he looked, or the reason, not the way he looked, that's not fair to say, he was handsome. He resented the reasons he looked that way. And my brother feels the same way. But he's been to Monticello, he came down once. So I appreciate him for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. And Carol asks, was Sally and her family accepted by the slave community or looked at as an outsider with her relationship with Thomas Jefferson and her separate living situation?
So I don't know. I can't answer that. I think that there's resentment, and we've read about that. There's resentment with the people who worked in the ground, as Jefferson called it, and that would have been out in the fields, and the people who worked in the house because they would have had more privileges and access to better food and better clothing and better living circumstances. My great-great-great-grandfather, Peter, for example, had his own space when he didn't want to be a cook. After a while, he just told Jefferson, I don't want to do this anymore. And he was trained as a brewer, described as intelligent. And there are instructions from Jefferson to set up Peter's house as he would like it to be. So I think it would be natural that there would have been some resentment there. Whether they were accepted or not, I don't know. Most of the people enslaved in the house, in the Jefferson household, were Hemings family members. And they also happen to have been related to Jefferson and his family. So it's likely there was some resentment, yes.
Makes sense, like all families, right?
Right, exactly.
Oh, I don't see any other questions. Let me just make sure. Don't see any others here at the moment. Well, I was wondering, just as someone who also has spent a lot of time researching her family's history, it seems to never end. There's always something new, even though you've written a book doesn't mean that there aren't more things to uncover or that you're interested in recovering. So I was wondering if there is anything else you're looking to reclaim.
Yeah, so as a matter of fact, thank you for that question. My research with my dad's family, and this lineage is on my dad's side, as I mentioned, continues. But I'm also looking into my mother's family. And the thing about the book is not just, the book is part memoir, part detective story, part history lesson. So it's not just about finding this ancestry, it's about the motivation why I did it. It's about growing up middle class and Black in Washington, D.C. It's about giving readers a chance to see through the lens, my lens, what life was like growing up in the 60s and 70s, and why or how I have grown in this process of learning about my family. Claiming that history and totally embracing my Black heritage, totally embracing it. You asked, or you made reference to someone asking whether I'm proud of my Jefferson ancestry. And as I like to say, it is what it is. But I'll tell you this, I'm really proud of my Black ancestry, really proud, because I know what they had to do. And moving forward, I'm now looking at my mother's family. My mother's family was extremely accomplished. My grandfather, and I came late, so my grandfather was a renowned White House chef, so famous that he was written about in newspapers. I did not know that. My mom would say, oh yeah, my dad, she would say, quote, well, my father was cook on the president's train, when I would talk about the Jefferson business. And I didn't pay attention to it. And when I would ask her more about it, she would just say, it was my family that was this and my family was that, without giving me much information. So I have another detective story before me. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited to learn more about my mom's family. I understand that there are actually pictures, at least one recording of my grandfather, perhaps at the Wilson Library. So I've got to go dig that up, because he traveled from coast to coast on the president's train, on Woodrow Wilson's train. Made all the more fascinating because of the ardent racist that Woodrow Wilson was. So it's a fascinating study to learn more about my grandfather and how he managed to negotiate, and my grandfather would have been a very proud man, negotiate through that very challenging world and in that challenging Jim Crow era. So that's going to be more about the Jim Crow era, whereas this was about Reclamation, was my memoir about growing, evolving. I consider myself a race woman now, becoming a race woman. And this will be more about Jim Crow and that my mom's family and what they had to do to survive. And also some of the prejudices within the Black community. We talked about the enslaved who worked in the house and those who worked in the ground and the fields, and the tension that existed. Many of the people who worked in the house, as it was in your family, were descended from their owners and had certain privileges, and that carried on through the generations in the Black community, where light-skinned people were held with greater esteem. And so I'm going to write about that, because that would not have been my mother's family experience. So I'm super excited to get into it, but right now we're just focusing on Reclamation.
All right, well, I'll be excited, because you'll have to take a trip to Princeton, I think, to go to the Wilson.
Yes, Wilson, yes.
So you'll come and visit me, and you'll bring that beautiful DT.
Yes.
Because I will say that inspired a lot of jealousy.
It's something to have. Yeah, it's something to have. And before we sign off, though, I understand you have some great news, if you're willing to share it. And I also love that picture of, tell me your great-grandmother's name again, begins with a T.
My great-great-grandmother, Tempe.
Tempe. Phenomenal picture. I wish we could show people that picture.
I don't have it with me, but it reminds me of what you've done with your book, is you have centered the enslaved women that we come from, and that whose story is often left out of our American story, but who are essential to our American story. So I'm so happy that you've done that.
Yes, thank you. And that's important. I'm glad you said that. There's been so much written about the founders and Jefferson. Enough. Let's talk about other Americans. Let's talk about our contributions to America. Let's have us, we at Monticello, we give parity to Jefferson and to the enslaved. That's huge. That's evolution. Let the rest of America evolve that way.
It certainly is, and it is the truth, right?
Yes, it's the truth. Absolutely.
So, Gayle, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great conversation. Great to see you. And great work. Congratulations to you as well.
Thank you. And you as well. I so enjoyed it. And other people are already running out to watch on to go. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Well, Gayle and Dionne, thank you so much for coming to Open Book, Open Mind for this illuminating, inspiring, and inevitably sometimes painful discussion. We really appreciate having you here. I wanted to say that Reclamation and also Slavery's Descendants are available for sale by our partner, Watch on Booksellers, and they're also available to borrow through the library. We at the library are all about giving it away, but as I always tell my the people who come to these programs, if you really admire a book, consider purchasing it. It's the greatest compliment that you can pay to an author. And if you want these kinds of books to keep going out into the world, and you want to support the writers who write them, and you want them to keep coming back to Open Book, Open Mind, then consider purchasing them. And finally, I wanted to say, actually, it was funny when you started talking about the 1619 Project, because our next program on Thursday, January 13th at 7 p.m., we're going to be hosting two major contributors to the 1619 Project. Harvard professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad and Jake Silverstein, who's the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine section, who helped edit the book. And they'll be in conversation about that #1 New York Times bestseller, landmark reframing of American history with slavery and race at its center. And they'll be talking to David Trout, the founding director of the Rutgers Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity. So we hope you'll join us, and be well. And thank you for coming. And we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.